within the department based on the appearance of loyalty to the president rather than the caliber of their qualifications. Compounding this problem, multiple senior-level civilian officers in the department have gone unfilled, necessitating the installment of career or mid-level officials into senior positions in an acting capacity. Finally, the president undermined our military justice system and chain of command by pardoning troops credibly accused, including by their peers, of war crimes. Moreover, we are facing extraordinary challenges. The world is engulfed in a global pandemic that has sickened millions of Americans, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, and produced severe economic damage. We are the victim of the largest cyber breach on record perpetrated by the Russians. Last Wednesday, the Capitol was stormed by a mob whose intent was to prevent Congress from performing its constitutional duty to certify the election. This attack was the greatest threat to constitutional order in my lifetime, and it shocked our allies while giving comfort and confidence to our adversaries around the globe. When the committee considers General Austin's nomination next week, we will thoroughly review this nomination in the historic context it's being presented and the impact it will have on future generations. Therefore, as we discuss the importance of civilian control of the armed forces this morning, I hope our witnesses can speak to the following issues. First, I'd like your views on how to encourage diversity of opinion within the Department of Defense when crafting policy and making national security decisions, rather than tilting one way to the military or completely the other way to the civilian. Second, I would like our witnesses' thoughts on whether providing a waiver will encourage senior military officers to be more political, and if they believe it could lead to a situation where future presidents will default to nominating retired general officers for the position of Secretary of Defense in lieu of qualified civilians. Third, if Congress provides a waiver for General Austin, I would like our witnesses to share their thoughts on the impact this will have on the durability of the existing statute. Finally, if General Austin is ultimately confirmed as a Secretary of Defense, I would welcome any recommendations from our witnesses on actions he could take to ensure his tenure protects and promotes the principle of civilian control of the military. Civilian control of the military, consistent with the Constitution, begins and ends with the Commander-in-Chief. It is the bedrock of our democracy, and it is the principle that President-elect Biden values and respects. Serving on this committee and providing oversight of the Department of Defense is a great privilege and an enormous responsibility, one that I take seriously. The events of the past several months have thrown into sharp relief how perilously close our nation has come to undermining the resiliency of our democratic institutions. While not broken, these institutions and principles have been repeatedly subject to extreme stress. This dire situation calls for stability and a duly confirmed Secretary of Defense who has responded to Congress in the confirmation process and will be responsive to Congress as well as the President in the execution of his duties. As we hear from our witnesses today and consider an exception for General Austin to serve as the Secretary of Defense, I expect that the debate will be robust and spirited, but I'm also confident that it will be respectful, as every member of this committee cares deeply about our men and women in uniform, their families, and the civilians and contractors who serve in the Department of Defense. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And with the Chairman's direction and permission, let me recognize our witnesses for their testimony. And if Dr. Cohn, you may begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I ask that my written testimony be made a part of
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, Senators, I am grateful for the opportunity to be here today. I would like to note that I am speaking in my personal capacity and my views do not represent those of the U.S. Naval War College or of any other organ of the U.S. government. There are important principles and values at stake here, some of which weigh for granting Mr. Austin a waiver and some of which weigh against it. I will do my best to lay out what I see as the most important issues at stake so that you can make the most informed decision possible. On the pro side are the principles that the president should generally be allowed to choose his or her own people unless there is a good reason to deny them, and that it is critical to break down the significant barriers faced by people of color and other underrepresented groups in the national security world and the world of governance more broadly. On these 2 points, Mr. Austin has a strong case. On the con side are several concerns about principles of civilian control of the military, civil-military relations more generally, and ultimately democratic governance. This is where I will focus my remarks, but I emphasize that systemic racism is as much a danger to principles of democratic governance as breakdowns in civilian control. The first point to address is why this law exists at all, as the chairman asked, what the principle of civilian control is, and why it's important. The law stems from a moment in which the US was creating a permanent national defense establishment of unprecedented size, scope, and responsibility, and Congress was motivated to ensure that this establishment would be firmly under political rather than uniformed military control. Since then, the size and power of the Department of Defense has arguably grown. It remains important, therefore, that this enormous commitment of public resources and American lives be subject and accountable to political authority and not solely to its own internal judgment. The principle of civilian control is about ensuring that the military organization serves the purposes of the Republic rather than serving its own organizational judgment or purposes. There are multiple mechanisms for achieving this, and the more mechanisms there are in place, the more secure the principle is. Some of these mechanisms are appropriate for a democratic republic to use, others are not. Legitimate mechanisms include having institutional structures that place politically appointed or elected civilians in positions of authority over the highest uniformed military officers, a legal system that holds military personnel accountable to laws made by Congress, and a professional military ethic of subordination to political control. Not legitimate for a democratic republic are mechanisms like pervasive ideological surveillance enforcing loyalty to a ruling ideology, making the officer corps consist largely of whatever demographic group holds political power, so in the public or national interest, a military logic. For those within the military, it is natural to want to approach a fight with overwhelming resources, overwhelming force, and few limitations on how they can employ that force. They provide the political logic of why force is being used in the first place. In sum, the principle of civilian or political control of the military is central both to healthy democratic governance and to effective use of force for political ends. One of the several important mechanisms for exercising that control is civilian political appointees exercising political rather than military logic in positions of authority. So those are the concerns relating to civilian control. There are also concerns relating to issues of civil-military relations and governance. The first is that granting this waiver would weaken the principle that civilians should be in control of the Defense Department and would very likely lead to more appointments of recently retired officers. Should that happen, there is the potential for further politicization of the officer corps, by which I mean an undesirable increase in either the reality or perception of military officers engaging in the usually partisan struggle for political power within the domestic system, something we have already noted as unhealthy. Third is that this appointment is likely to strengthen a general perception that military experience and expertise are the same thing as security, defense, or foreign policy expertise. They are not the same, and it is important that both be well represented in defense and security policy making. In short, as Hamilton warned, if the people believe that only professional military officers understand how to protect them, it is a short step to the belief that only professional military officers know how to govern them. Fourth is the issue of public trust in the system and in political institutions. Choosing a recently retired general officer and arguing that he is uniquely qualified to meet the current challenges furthers a narrative that military officers are better at things and more reliable or trustworthy than civil servants or other civilians. This is hugely problematic at a time when one of the biggest challenges facing the country is the need to restore trust and faith in the political system. Implying that only a military officer can do this job at this time is counterproductive to that goal. There is also a danger that elected officials may use the public's trust in the military to avoid difficult parts of politics. Military personnel should not be used as shields for political choices. In order to restore trust and confidence in the system, elected officials must embrace the responsibility of making the public case for difficult choices. While I've argued that this nomination is troubling on grounds of healthy governance and institutions, there are several ways that these concerns could be mitigated, things that both these chambers and Mr. Austin and the Biden administration can do. I've outlined these in my written statement, and I'm happy to elaborate. There are ways in which granting this waiver and confirming Mr. Austin will make efforts to restore trust in the political system more difficult. Should this chamber choose that path, it will be important to ensure that the administration is doing what it can to rebuild civilian expertise and authority in the Department of Defense and the government more broadly. In other ways, Mr. Austin may be the right person for the job at this moment. The president-elect will need his team to work together smoothly and seamlessly to deal with the extreme challenges they face, both domestically and abroad. Mr. Austin's leadership could be a step in the right direction of diversifying the upper levels of the national security establishment. Our country faces a difficult time, and the incoming administration must balance a number of competing priorities, central among them the need to restore the legitimacy of the principles and institutions of democratic governance. Mr. Austin's nomination will neither heal nor break American democracy by itself, but it is a critical node in the web. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And let me now recognize our other witness, Dr. McGinnis. Thank you, Doctor. And just a reminder, if you can stay close to the 5 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I ask that my written testimony may be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, for the opportunity to join you this morning to discuss civilian control of the armed forces. It is an honor to be here for this conversation on behalf of the Congressional Research Service. The Founding Fathers placed limits on the armed forces in order to ensure that the military is both subordinate and accountable to the political leadership of the United States. Control of the armed forces is a shared responsibility of both the executive and legislative branches. Tensions arise, of course, but the fundamental subordination of the military to the civilians that they serve has remained intact due to careful oversight and daily management by both branches of the U.S. government. 150 years after the founding, the experience of World War II convinced many, including President Truman, of the need for greater coordination of a larger standing military in a single defense department. Yet concerns were raised that a single individual serving as head of all the U.S. armed forces might become too powerful, and even more so if that person had previously served as a military officer. This concern led to the provision commonly referred to as the cooling off period between military service and SecDef appointment. At the time, the period was 10 years. In 2008, Congress reduced it to 7 years. There have been 2 exceptions to that waiting period, for General Marshall in 1950 and for General Mattis in 2017. 4 years ago, this committee heard testimony on the risks that confirming a recently retired general officer into the position of Secretary of Defense might introduce. It was observed that tactical and operational leadership, especially within a deeply hierarchical and nonpartisan institution like the military, does not necessarily provide adequate preparation for the complexity of a Secretary of Defense's inherently political roles. The position of Secretary of Defense is unique within the U.S. government. They serve as the principal advisor to the president on defense matters. They are the only unelected civilian leader in the military chain of command. They are responsible for adjudicating budget disputes. They represent DoD in interagency discussions. They serve as a key node for Congress's oversight and civilian control of the military. They manage one of the largest workforces in the world. They serve as a point of communication between the Department of Defense and the American public, and all the while, They must constantly and vigorously protect the military from politicization. Those tasks are a tall order for anybody. So, success depends upon the health of the Department of Defense as an institution, and in particular, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The latter helps the Secretary provide routine civilian oversight over the department. A growing chorus of defense experts argue that those civilian institutions are now at a low point. Some reasons for this assessment include failures to nominate and confirm experienced and effective political appointees, which has allowed, if not encouraged, other institutions in DoD to marginalize civilian leadership on matters such as planning, and mandated headquarters personnel reductions, which have served to increase the workload on a shrinking staff in the face of an increasingly dangerous strategic landscape. According to this view, in order for the Secretary to provide effective authority, direction, and control over the armed forces, these institutions ought to be revitalized. Now, these issues existed when Secretary Mattis assumed the reins of the Department of Defense, and for a variety of reasons, they have since accelerated. Observers argue that the net result has been to create an inversion of the civilian-military relations dialogue, with the military now more dominant on defense matters on a day-to-day basis than their civilian counterparts. This is why the Bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission stated that they were struck by the imbalance of civilian and military voices on critical issues of strategy development and implementation. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to raise and supervise the military, and by extension, the Pentagon. Many observers therefore contend that a top priority for the Secretary of Defense, in partnership with Congress, should be to revitalize and improve DoD's civilian institutions and workforce. Put a bit differently, considerable time and attention is paid to the health of the military's personnel, equipment, and so on, yet there's no comparable metrics for civilian workforce health and readiness. Regardless of who ultimately sits in the position of Secretary of Defense, addressing this matter is an option Congress might want to consider in order to revitalize civilian control of the military and ensure our civilian institutions are robust enough to do their work effectively. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the American government wields its power through the consent of the governed. The founders intended that this principle would apply unambiguously to the military as well. Thank you, and I await your questions.
Thank you very much. And now, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Chairman Inhofe for his questions.
Well, thank you, Senator Reed. I think it'd be a good idea, and since I mentioned that I didn't believe that a waiting period was really necessary, so it wouldn't be necessary to waive it. Although I've studied a little bit more in the opening statements of both of our witnesses. And so let me just do this. I'm going to go ahead and read that part of the Title 10 that is verbatim here. Quote, I'm quoting now, there is a Secretary of Defense who is the head of the Department of Defense appointed from civilian life by the President by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. A person may not be appointed as Secretary of Defense within 7 years after release from active duty as a commissioned officer of a regular component of the armed forces. Now, Dr. Khan, you know, this is kind of arbitrary, I guess, the 7 years. Is there a reason for 7 years instead of 4 years or 1 year or in general? Is this a threshold that we ought to keep or should change, maybe be considered?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You are correct. The number 7 is somewhat arbitrary. The original number 10 was also arbitrary. It was a nice round number. And 7 was the compromise between leaving it at 10 and reducing it to 5, which was the debate that came up in 2007, 2008. However, I do think that 7 years is actually a good period because, as multiple people have pointed out, it allows a minimum of 2 rotations for military deployments and assignments, which means that that allows time for the command relationships and the people in those command positions to change significantly from the time that the recently retired officer was in a position of command. That helps in a lot of ways to mitigate the problem that both you and Mr. Ranking Member mentioned about Mr. Mattis relying heavily on his network of military contacts. Thank you.
Well, we're suffering from some interruptions right now, and I can't tell, Senator Reid, can you tell from where you are what's the cause of those?
No, sir, but
Some members need to put their microphones on mute. Dick, you need to be on mute. Dick Blumenthal, you're not on mute, so we're getting back from you. And anyone else who's not on mute needs to mute their screens. That's the back sound.
All right, that sounds good to me. All right, we read that, but I also, in my opening statement, I talked about the NDS, the commission that was, and we're following that pretty closely. I'm going to go ahead and read what that commission says. Now, this is the NDS. I don't have that with me right now, but I do have the quote from it. It says, the report states civilian voices have been relatively muted on issues at the center of the U.S. defense and national security policy, undermining the concept of civilian control. The implementation of the NDS must feature empowered civilians fulfilling their statutory responsibilities, particularly regarding the issues of force management. So starting with Dr. Khan and then Dr. McGinnis, you agree with the assessment by the NDS Commission that, quote, civilian voices are relatively muted? And if so, why is this such a big problem in our democracy? Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say yes, I do agree with that assessment. I think that the civilian side of the Department of Defense has lost both influence and respect over the last several years. And I think that is a problem for the reasons outlined in my written testimony in terms of the need for diverse experiences and particularly the need for an understanding of what I have called political logic. That is people who are dedicated to thinking about defense and security in policy terms and not just in what we might think of as practical military terms. I think that the military side is well represented in the debates internal to the department. What's happening now that is the civilian side is less well represented, and that creates an imbalance and I think produces worse policy. Thank you, sir.
Well, and Dr. McGinnis, do you agree? I think the key part there is civilian voices are relatively muted. Do you think so?
Senator, there is considerable evidence that's part of the public record now that suggests that that is indeed the case, that comports with the National Defense Strategy Commission's assessment. It's worth noting that the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the civilian voices that are in this case being relatively muted, is the practical eyes, arms, ears, legs of the Secretary of Defense. They are there to do the day-to-day work of civilian oversight of the military. They write this, they work with their counterparts overseas to understand political and military dynamics that might impact the national security of the United States. They go to war zones and help military commanders really understand secretary's intent. They are the practical, where the rubber meets the road of civilian military relations. The Office of the Secretary of Defense is where it happens. And according to the National Defense Strategy Commission, as well as, again, a growing chorus of voices that I referred to in my opening statement, those civilian voices are relatively muted now. A couple of reasons that are worth calling attention to include, again, this question of appointment of political appointees within the system, the failure to do so, and having civil servants being in acting capacities has served to, if there's nobody in the civilian side of the house to do the work, then the advice, the decisions on matters of national strategy are going to migrate inherently to the institutions that are appropriately staffed. Why does this matter? I refer once again to the National Defense Strategy and the National Defense Strategy Commission's reports. The NDSC Commission notes that China is engaged in a whole of society strategy to accomplish its objectives, many of which are counter to U.S. objectives. The political military nature of the security environment which we are operating in requires political military connections and connective tissue between the military instrument and the broader political objectives of this country and the broader prerogatives of the president himself. Without the civilian side of the house, without that civilian pillar being able to do its job effectively, we are missing a critical voice, a critical note, a critical connective tissue in this discussion, if you agree with the National Defense Strategy Commission's report on this matter.
Well, you know, we're going to be having the hearing coming up. So if a waiver is granted, I'd like to ask each one of you, what types of questions should we ask to mitigate some of the potential problems that might come with having the waiver granted? Hear from both of you, Dr. Khan and Dr. McGinnis. What should we be pursuing in the hearing in the event that this waiver is granted?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a couple of questions that you ought to ask Mr. Austin would include things like how he plans to demonstrate his commitment to empowering the civilian side of the Department of Defense, how he plans to foster relationships of respect and trust between the civilian staff and the uniformed staff. I think you should ask him how he sees the differences between his role as a military commanding officer and his role as the Secretary of Defense, and you should want to know that he is committed to the idea of being a political actor and no longer a military actor receiving and obeying orders or simply giving military advice, that he should be willing to engage with the press, willing to be transparent with Congress, with this committee and with the House Armed Services Committee, and that he should generally express an understanding of the different nature of the role that he will be playing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. McGinnis. What do you think?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question invites us to consider that the Secretary of Defense is one person that's put in an institutional role that is inherently political, inherently multifaceted. It's as one scholar put it, it's the impossible job within the department because there's so much to it, and therefore the health of the institution of the Department of Defense is critically important to ensuring that the day-to-day business, any strengths, weaknesses, whatever, are managed, and that the business of national security can be advanced. So in order to be effective, they need the Secretary of Defense needs to have the confidence of the President, the Congress, and the military and the Department of Defense. So to that end, if you are interested in teasing out whether those relationships will be solid and comport with what you would like to see, some suggestions might include, whether or not the nominee would be amenable to taking a close look at the health of the civilian workforce. Also, with respect to relations with the Congress, one proposal that was tabled last time when it was the nomination of Secretary Mattis was considered, was whether or not the then nominee Mattis would testify in front of the House Armed Services Committee. That might be another option to consider.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank the witnesses again. And I think the chairman has really focused in on some of the critical questions that we have to address. But one point is my reflection on the context of the National Defense Strategy Commission is that the authors detected this decline in civilian authority over several years. It wasn't an abrupt change as a result of General Mattis or anyone else. So this is a tendency that was happening even when we had civilians as Secretary of Defense. Is that accurate in your view? Thank you.
Yes,
Go ahead.
that's Yes, that is accurate.
Yeah. So we have, regardless of who the nominee is, a challenge to restore a much stronger balance of civilian control. And one factor, particularly if General Austin is indeed confirmed, would be to put robust civilians as quickly as possible into critical roles like the undersecretary, deputy secretary, the policy secretary. Is that a strong view that you would share, Dr. Cohn?
Yes, Senator, I think so, very much.
Dr. McGinnis?
The analysis would suggest that, sir.
Yes. And, you know, I do think that the chairman's questions about the issues we should raise, your responses were quite good, in fact, very good, which is basically the understanding that General Austin would have of a new role, which is not similar to, and I believe he is, you know, he's intelligent enough to grasp this, but he has to demonstrate not only an intellectual, but also a sort of complete commitment to this, which is to understand that he is in a political role, bureaucratic politics, not electoral politics, but bureaucratic politics, and that he has to rely, frankly, if he's given this opportunity, on the expertise of others that have much more of that experience. And I think that is consistent with your comments too. The other aspect of this is that, yeah, even though he is clearly a professional, in fact, a superb professional military officer, many of his tasks, certainly as the CENTCOM commander, put him face to face with the with very difficult political judgments. So in that context, would you think he would have some insights already into the political dynamics of national security policy? Dr. Cohn?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, of course, anyone who reaches the level of 4 stars has political experience of the type involving diplomatic efforts, thinking about policy significance. They have, of course, been asked to provide advice to policymakers. So he certainly has some of this experience, and no one is questioning either his competency or his savvy in terms of understanding political implications. I think the main differences that I would point out are, first of all, his, let's say, default logic when he comes to dealing with problems and issues, and whether the first thing that he thinks of is how to achieve larger political goals using a wide array of tools and mechanisms, or whether he thinks of it from the perspective of an army officer.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, again, is that there are multiple meanings of political. What you have described is political in the sense that it is dealing with bargaining, and that is important. But there is also political in the sense of the power dynamic, especially the partisan power dynamic within domestic politics and the domestic system. And this is something that Mr. Austin will be aware of, but will never have had to personally play in. And that, I think, is something, and we saw with Mr. Mattis that that was something he was very uncomfortable doing. And that is problematic, given, as Dr. McInnes has described, the role of the Secretary of Defense. Thank you.
Dr. McGinnis, brief comments. I only have about 20 seconds.
Sure. The question invites us to consider the role of a combatant commander, a 4-star a general officer, and the experiences that they've had. A 4-star combatant commander has had lots of experience with the pointy end of the spear, and there's a lot of political military dynamics associated with that, as you point out. But spears have a huge shaft as well. There's a whole lot that goes into making the pointy end of the spear effective. And as a result, you know, with it as applied to the Department of Defense, there's Title X responsibilities, there's strategy. I mean, all kinds of different things that the secretary is responsible for. So in consideration of this question of civilian-military relations, it invites us to consider the broader team and how the broader team is going to be able to handle these responsibilities on behalf of the nation. National security is a team sport.
Thank you very much. And I would ask my colleagues to try to adhere as close as possible to the 5-minute rule. And with that, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, I'd like to recognize Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Reid. I'd like to explore a little bit further the quote that Senator Inhofe used in the 2018 report of the National Defense Strategy Commission, where concern was expressed about the state of civil-military relations at the time. Dr. McGinnis and Dr. Cohn, what is your assessment of the current state of civilian-military relations? And do you agree that this is a trend which is moving in the wrong direction?
Thank you, Senator. The evidence out there does comport with the National Defense Strategy Commission's assessment of civilian-military relations. And it is up to this committee to determine whether you agree with this assessment. But it does suggest that if the civilian pillar within the Department of Defense is not up to optimum health, and as you rightly point out, these are longstanding trends. Furloughs, headquarters reductions, political appointments. These are issues that go back at least a decade. And have accumulated over time. So if we do want to see healthy civilian-military relations being conducted on a day-to-day basis, it would argue for paying attention to the health of the civilian workforce and the political appointees, the team that is put in to support whoever the Secretary of Defense will be.
What do you think is the most concerning aspect of it? The example the commission uses is the empowerment of the Joint Staff at the expense of civilian staff within the office of the Secretary. Are there other examples? And Dr. Cohn, please jump in as well.
There are a variety of manifestations of this issue. One being, again, the failure to have confirmed political appointees within positions, which combatant commanders of Joint Staff, when they look for civilian guidance and they are confronted with an acting who does not have the authority for the department to make decisions in the way that somebody who's been confirmed does, they naturally sort of, it's human nature. They just sort of go around that. But then there's also procedure elements of this as well. Dr. Mara Carlin notes that there are a number of provisions in statute with respect to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's role, statutory responsibilities that sort of overlap with civilian dimensions of policymaking in the department. And in procedure, there's just how a policy, how an instruction is staffed out, and how the war plans are staffed out, and how the review process works within process matters in the Pentagon, as you know. But looking at some of these instructions, the routine, halfway marks, waypoints, checkpoints within the process seem to have not included civilian voices in those in the procedures.
Okay, Dr. Cohn, if you'd like to speak to that, and also, do you think that when we create exemptions and allow recently retired officers to serve as Secretary of Defense, does that influence this issue at all?
Thank you, Senator. To answer your second question first, yes, I think it does, of course, weaken the norm or the principle, and I think that should be an issue of concern for you as you make this decision. But of course, whether it undermines the norm completely is up to you in the future. You will have the opportunity to make this decision again, and you can change the direction of that norm. In terms of the civil-military relationships, both within the Department of Defense and more broadly in society, I think what we have seen is a really troubling set of mutually reinforcing trends, negative trends. As Dr. McInnes has described, in the department, you have many, many years worth of hiring freezes, personnel cuts, difficulty filling positions with Senate-confirmed members and using acting people or leaving them vacant. And that is extremely troubling. But this is reinforced by a larger situation in the American public of a worrying trend of over-deference to military expertise and military experience, and a worrying trend of less interest in active self-governance, and a sort of willingness to turn over decision-making to the military. And I think these trends are both troubling, they are mutually reinforcing, and they should be something that this chamber seriously considers as something that needs to be addressed going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Reid.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. And again, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing. And one of the things that has come up several times in your responses, Dr. Cohn and Dr. McInnes, has been the operating within a partisan environment, which we know is very much the case right now in Washington, and that the country is very divided. And this is not exactly on point for the waiver, but I think it is another troubling trend within the military. And you mentioned this, Dr. McInnes, in your June 2020 CRS report on the military, that you highlight the importance of civilian control, but you also reference that the nonpartisan culture of the military is one of the reasons that it has enjoyed such a high regard in the American public. And I think one of the more recent polls had 73% of Americans who viewed the military with high regard. But one of the things that is troubling is that we're seeing more and more partisanship within the military. And so I wonder, as you're thinking about the waiver issue and about what we need to ensure the division between civilian and military control, if you can speak to whether this is an issue that is going to be affected by granting another waiver and having further military control of the Department of Defense. And how should we handle that erosion of the nonpartisanship within the military? Are there things that Congress and the executive branch should be doing to address that? We saw it again in the insurrection at the Capitol on the 6th, that there were a number of former military and actually at least one active military participant in that who has since resigned. So as we think about the challenges, how should we be thinking about that aspect of what's going on within the military? Dr. McInnes, maybe you could begin.
Actually, if it's okay, I'd like to turn to Dr. Cohn, who has written extensively on this matter.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Senator, for these questions. I would say I think your analysis is correct. I would say there are a couple of things that can be done to deal with this problem in some ways. And the two most important ones that I can think of are that elected officials in general, both in the executive and in the legislative branches, should work to protect the military from partisan politics. Do not use them as props. Do not use them as shields. Do not base your arguments for legislation on the effect that they will have on members of the military and their families and veterans. These are all, of course, very important things. Members of the military and their families and veterans have needs, but they are not the only reason to pass legislation. And it's important not to give that impression to the American people that that's the only justification for many things that need to be done for other reasons. So protect the military from partisan politics. In terms of what it has to do with this particular nomination, I would say that the biggest mitigating factor would be to encourage Mr. Austin to emphasize his new role and his separation from his military role, and the fact that what he is doing is a different kind of thing than what military officers do. And I think that those two things should help. In the end, however, partisan polarization is a broad social phenomenon, and our military is, of course, representative of our public, or at least we hope to keep it that way. And any phenomena that show up in the broader society will affect the military. So in the end, we have to work on partisan polarization as a larger problem in order to heal it within the military. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. McGinnis, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I was struck as Dr. Cohen was speaking about some of the other broader trends that are factor in play in this discussion, which is, over the years, the U.S. military has seen the lion's share of resources allocated towards it, and a lion's share of attention allocated towards it when it comes to matters of national security relative to institutions like the State Department and USAID. So there is a shift towards focusing on the Department of Defense. Tasks, missions are going over to the Department of Defense as a result. And that sort of raises questions about how we think about what the military does for national security, what's its appropriate role, and have we gotten that right?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I'm out of time, but it speaks to the need to rebalance the role of our State Department and our Department of Defense, so that our State Department is doing the diplomacy that is required before we would call in troops to address conflicts and other issues. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Senator Reid. I want to thank both of our witnesses for appearing. I want to make an observation up front. When we talk about civilian control of the military and the implications for this waiver, I don't think anyone believes that civilian control of the military is seriously at risk from Lloyd Austin's nomination. We all have immense respect for Lloyd Austin and his service in uniform. We have immense respect for General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the other senior leaders of our armed forces and our combatant commands. So the question we're really facing here is whether the experiences and the skills and the relationships that career military officers bring to the job after being recently retired is right for that job. So I want to speak first to our witnesses about some perceptions. Ms. Cohn, you write the idea that we're going to confirm recently retired flag officers to be Secretary of Defense 2 administrations in a row could help create the perception that the terminal point in one's military career is not being a four-star officer, but rather being Secretary of Defense. Is there any way that we can avoid that perception, given the fact that actions speak louder than words, if we move forward with this waiver?
Thank you, Senator. As I said, I do think that granting 2 waivers in a row will seriously weaken the norm of this being an exception rather than the rule. I do think that it will seriously implicate, this problem that exactly the way you describe it, that the culmination of an officer's career is not 4-star, but Secretary of Defense. Can that be mitigated? That will be difficult. I think the only way that this chamber can mitigate that is to be very, very clear in the specific reasons that they think Mr. Austin is the right person for this job at this time, and especially to maintain the statute as it stands, not to simply think that, well, we've granted 2 exceptions in a row and therefore the statute is dead and doesn't really count as law anymore, but to emphasize that this chamber really believes in the principle and is making an exception to what they think is an important rule. Thank you.
And also, you point out a couple other perceptions I won't dwell on, is that you say the perception of expertise residing in military officers only, and you distinguish, I think, capably between military expertise on the one hand and security or foreign policy expertise on the other hand. And then, of course, the perception of possible favoritism or chauvinism for one service or one regional combatant command. I want to move on next to the political nature of this job. Not partisan in nature, but the inherently political nature when a Secretary of Defense has to engage in sometimes heated political disputes with inside the Department of Defense, between services and between combatant commands and agencies, with senior staff at the White House, within the cabinet over budgetary priorities, with Congress over similar priorities, yes, engage with the media as well. I point out that in my lifetime, I think 4 of the most consequential and successful Secretaries of Defense all had significant political experience. 3 of them had partisan experience, either Kathleen Berger, Dick Cheney, Leon Panetta, and Bob Gates. They had partisan experience, but I think he writes in his memoirs, he had a lot of political experience from his career as a civilian official at the CIA, and then a lot of political experience being a university president at Texas A&M as well. Ms. Cohn, does the skills and experiences that you gain in the military, which is inherently apolitical and designed to be so in our republic, prepare you for all of those political disputes that you might have as Secretary of Defense?
Senator, I think the short answer to that is no. I think obviously the experience you gain as a 4-star military officer is immense. It's important. It's helpful to understanding all of the things that need to be done to understanding many of the things that need to be done in the Department of Defense. But as you point out, many of our most successful Secretaries of Defense have not only extensive interagency experience, but sometimes also legislative experience. And it is simply not the case that a military officer who has spent his or her entire career, again, 4-star officers, the higher you get in the military hierarchy, the more alike those officers are. And many of them come from combat arms backgrounds, like yourself. And that is a certain type of experience that is important and helpful, but I do not think comprehensive in the way that you would want a Secretary of Defense to have experience. Thank you.
All right, thank you. One final question. On page 10 of your testimony, you assessed the tenures of Secretary Marshall and Secretary Mattis. I commend everyone to read those brief histories. Were those tenures, after they had received these waivers, successes to be repeated or cautionary tales about the wisdom of this 7-year cooling off period?
Senator, I think as Dr. McInnes has really ably demonstrated, the job of Secretary of Defense is incredibly difficult and almost no one is ever really prepared for it. However, I think that both the tenures of Secretary Marshall and Secretary Mattis basically reinforced the concerns of the members of Congress who made that initial statute. They relied very heavily on their military networks. They seemed to be uncomfortable dealing with political issues and, in Marshall's case, with protecting the president from an overambitious